right across North America. And it's a big shrub thing, and it blocks out other shrubs. And what's happened is somehow the Henry's elephant has found a camelliates that will survive on this plant. And now that butterfly we consider more uncommon and widespread in the Ottawa area in the last 10 years. So it's making a difference to that species. Something we got to keep track of, though. And maybe eventually the toxin, it is a toxic plant to some species, so it might affect the Henry's elephant's ability to breed. We're not sure. So we need to look at climate change. You're all hearing the horror stories about climate change, particularly in the Arctic, polar bears, and big animals tend to be very much affected by the warming of our climate from these gases that are building there, carbon dioxide, etc. I looked at climate change the way they did in Europe, where they actually did a huge study on European butterfly species, taking most of the resident ones, and they tracked them over time, using all that data I was talking about before, like in England and other parts, and they were noticing butterflies moving north every year. And on average, I think some of them were hitting like 200 kilometers a year. They were moving. They could survive the winter better. That's what it amounted to, and what's the only factor that could affect that? The climate was warming. So I thought I'd look at Eastern Ontario, and since I've been back from England, or actually just before one of them and one after, we have found several new butterfly species that we know weren't there. We had hundreds of observers out looking at butterflies over 100 years in Eastern Ontario. We know what the butterflies are. And then in 1998, in the middle of a field, lo and behold, I found a little Delaware skipper on the left. Just sitting there, and I thought, where did that come from? And within 5 years, it had expanded right into the Ottawa area, and it's now in western Quebec. And I can take you out and find you 15 colonies in a day. So it went from none to expanding and perhaps locally uncommon. Even more spectacular is the big, beautiful, giant swallowtail at the bottom there. When I was a kid living in Ajax, my dream was to find a giant swallowtail, one that would have strayed up from Peely or something, because that's where it was known from. It's a Carolinian butterfly, found in extreme southwestern Ontario for many years. It is moving northeast all the time. And just last year, well, now it's a resident species in Prince Edward County. You can go down there and see 30 in a day. Just last year, I was driving on a road through the Rideau Lakes just south of Ottawa, and I counted a dozen of them along the road, just driving. So that's not saying what else is back there in the field. They found there's a larval food plant called prickly ash, which is a member of the citrus family, and they're feeding on that right through. So they're not feeding on hop trees. We don't have hop trees. They're feeding on prickly ash, which is a major revelation for us. The Ottawa area is full of prickly ash. I can take you out into fields with zillions of these things. There's nothing to stop this thing from coming north except the climate, and it's obviously withstanding the cold climate because winters are overall warming up. So climate change is making a difference to butterflies in Eastern Ontario. These ones in a positive way. But as usual, there's a negative side to every one of these stories. And climate change, for something like this tiny little thing called the bog elfin, which is found in very isolated little acidic spruce tamarack bogs, just in Eastern Ontario, up to St. Lawrence and into sort of New Brunswick and then down into Maine and that area. So it's got a very narrow range of distribution only in these kind of bogs. What will happen in 20 years when things warm up? Its plant that it feeds on, black spruce, is not able to tolerate those changes and dies out in the bogs. Where's this butterfly going to go? It's a bog species. It can't suddenly take off and head across country. It doesn't do that. So there's a species that we should keep an eye on and be tracking, definitely. And even though it's not in bad shape now, I would argue that it's one that we should be keeping a close eye on. Not yet, but coming on. So how can you talk about butterflies and conservation without looking at the monarch? The most recognizable butterfly in the world. I've been in Australia and I've been in Europe, lived in Europe and Africa and South America. And whenever I kind of talk to people, and if you ask them, what do you know about butterflies? Oh, I know the monarch. And it's because it is worldwide. And interestingly, it's found throughout a lot of the continents, but it's a resident species that doesn't migrate. Actually, I should be letting Don Davis get up and give this little bit of the talk. Don, where are you? This is Don's specialty area, but I'll say a few words about it anyway. So the monarchs from here, we know, head south in the winter, in the fall, and they end up in the winter down in these isolated little patches of woodland high up in the mountains of Mexico. Oyamel fir is the species of tree, and they gather in huge, huge clumps. hundreds of millions of these things, and they gather, and they sit there over winter, and then they start to move around, they mate, they move north, the female lays eggs, have another generational cycle, another quick one, and then sometimes 3 or 4 generations later, these are what show up in our backyard here in Ontario. And one of the big problems, of course, is in those pine forests, people are illegally cutting down the pine, so they're eliminating the wintering habitat, and these things won't survive if they can't group together and sort of keep warm. They cluster, that's why they cluster. So that's a risk, but now the Mexican government's taking this quite seriously, and they're trying to do things to protect this area and help people get sustainable livelihoods in the area. Very important. We're not free of guilt on the monarch. We use pesticides, a lot of it in agricultural areas. Where do you find the monarch? It's out in open fields and agricultural areas, roadside ditches, where the milkweed plant that it feeds on, and there you see the larvae on the left, sitting on a milkweed, and the milkweeds are actually, could be toxic for them if there's pesticides that have drifted off the cornfields. Later development came where we started to get into something called genetically modified organisms, GMO crops, hybrid corn being the most famous one. And one of the things they built into the hybrid corns was a bacteria called Bacillus thuringiensis, which is deadly to a lot of, pretty well any Lepidoptera larvae, which it killed the European corn borer, which eats corn, so that was good for the farmers, but there was worry that this stuff, when it produced pollen, when the plants produced pollen, the pollen would drift off into the roadside ditches, onto the milkweed, and monarchs would eat it. Lab tests said, yes, 40% of monarch caterpillars died when they ate the pollen coming off those corns, and everybody went, whoa, this is serious. Then they did subsequent studies to find that it doesn't drift as much as that in most locations, so it's not that big a risk outside the lab. And they're also moving towards these new hybrid biological pesticides that are less toxic to monarchs. So there's a bit of good news, a bit of bad news there, but we've got to keep an eye on it. There's the monarch. I told you I'd touch briefly on human use. This is not a major factor related to species survival or large populations, but a lot of you have probably been to butterfly conservations, the big greenhouses with tropical plants, and butterflies will land on you, and they have all these tropical species there. And that's okay, because like that little girl at the top, it gets them very interested in butterflies. You actually have a butterfly land on you. I mean, that's an amazing thing to happen, and you can look at it. And if they're tropical species, even if they escape, they're not going to survive the winter anyway, so they don't pose a long-term problem. So I'm okay with that. I'm a little less okay with the bottom left-hand photo where you have some people releasing butterflies at special events. So people do that at birthdays and funerals and weddings like this one. And yes, it sounds great, and you let the species go. If it was a locally reared species, no problem, that's beneficial. But enterprising individuals are shipping these things around, this pupae around, like you can get a California monarch, and you let them release. What's going to happen if they breed with an eastern monarch that has a completely different migratory stratagem and instincts? What's going to happen? Will that thing find Mexico? We don't know. So not something you really want to risk. So I'm a little more cautious. Then there is the actual capturing of specimens for scientific collections. This friend of mine out in the field. And it's what scientists do. You need voucher specimens if you want to study them, database them properly. We have a giant database of 300,000 records of butterflies in Canada, built by this gentleman in the field of the net named Ross Layberry. And Ross just went to every collection and took all the data off it, and now we can create distribution maps for species right across Canada, as they're known to this day. So a very useful thing. Got to be careful though, you don't go in and randomly start taking risk, species at risk for endangered species. So the last question, and what I'll focus on at the end from the end of my talk, is the obvious one. Well, if that's the case, how can we collectively protect butterflies? If it's habitat loss that's the major problem, then clearly habitat protection is what you have to do. And I like to use this little example. This is my favorite butterfly. It's called the early hair streak. It's always been considered one of the rarest butterflies in eastern North America. Found up on the top of beech maple wood forests, and rarely seems to come to the ground. And so I went years and years and years and never saw one of these, and I always wanted to. I love it. Its French name is Pan Mystérieuse, the mysterious elephant. I thought what a great name. And lo and behold, back in the 80s, I was walking up this little road up in the Gatineau Park, just north of Ottawa, and you see that little puddle on the left. I can see things flying around on the ground, so immediately my radar goes up, butterflies, and I'm down on my knees with my camera and equipment. There's at least a dozen of this thing sitting there sipping up the moisture on the ground. I thought, isn't that great? And to the point where these things were actually slightly inebriated, I could reach out and poke one, and it simply fell over. Little drunk butterflies. No wonder they're being so cooperative, but I got some nice pictures of it, so I'm not complaining. But the point of this is that habitat you see around it is part of a national park. The Gatineau Park belongs to the National Capital Commission, and it's a protected area. So if this species lives there, and the beech trees that it feeds on, the new buds of the beech trees, it'll be okay. But you don't need to just save habitats as they are. You can also improve them. And I know that there's a lot of sort of butterfly gardens popping up at universities all around the world, and I visited quite a few of them, and these are great. I helped found one, as Antonia mentioned, in Ottawa called the Fletcher Wildlife Garden. In the first year, what I decided to do was to survey the butterflies every year. Try to go in, 4 or 5 times a year, just sample and survey them. Keep track of them. And first year, 8 species in the whole of these 7 hectares, because it was just grass with a ravine running down the middle. We started planting in habitats, and we recreated sedge meadows, woodlots, old fields, and we started planting in things that, lots of milkweed and other things that we like. As of last year, we're now up to 45 species for this little 7-hectare plot, including the little eastern-tailed blue you see there, which used to be considered extremely rare in Canada, was found in the Ottawa area, but now it's locally common right throughout the area. So, and this is one of the habitats it's decided to plant itself in. There's been a colony there for at least 5 years. But the thing I really like, though, is habitat creation. It's sort of a bit of a new concept. You start from literally nothing.